Hi there, my name is Jessica Rudnick, and I'm an extension specialist with the California Sea Grant. I'm here to share my talk today titled The Role of Boundary Organizations in Agriculture Environmental Governance as a brief overview for a larger project where we're aiming to connect theories on boundary organizations and narratives and apply it to a real-world case study on governance of agriculture non-point source pollution in California. So I'll dive right in. Environmental policy often involves conflict and cooperation between many different stakeholder groups. These can be different communities, researchers, policymakers, industry actors. And the lack of shared knowledge or values can limit the ability of these different groups to effectively communicate with one another. So for example, the network here is the climate debate happening on Twitter right now, where politicians, who are shown in red, generally talk amongst each other, whereas scientists, who are shown in blue, often talk amongst themselves. And the boundary organization serves as the actor that's situated in the boundary between these different communities. And they have joint accountability to both sides, which helps them to act as communication bridges, translators, and mediators. And in a lot of science policy contexts, these boundary organizations play a number of different important roles, like convening the necessary actors to be in the room to engage in a problem, framing the problem in a way that's relatable to different groups, and mediating across different cultural norms such that technical and vernacular terms can be put into familiar language that both sides can understand. And there are many well-known examples of boundary organizations, like the U.S. Department of Agriculture climate hubs, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the cooperative extension arms of land-grant universities, and even the NCSE itself. And despite fairly wide-reaching agreement that boundary organizations must be salient, credible, and legitimate in order to be effective in this work, there's been relatively little attention as to how boundary organizations do this work and what strategies do they use to bridge these communication divides. So our work is arguing that boundary organizations use policy narratives to help them establish their salience, credibility, and legitimacy. And a policy narrative is a story that actors tell to frame the natural or social events going on. They weave together different events and they advocate for a policy outcome. We've all experienced these stories, images, discourses in news and media, and they're often used to get stakeholder buy-in and policy engagement on an issue. They have a large influence shaping public opinion, and they can be particularly important when these issues are very complex, and they help people make sense of cause and effect and therefore form their policy preferences. So policy studies have given a lot of attention to these stories in trying to develop more systematic ways to characterize narrative elements so that we can compare different types of stories and understand how effective they are. I use one of these narrative strategies called the narrative policy framework as a tool to evaluate the narratives that boundary organizations use. In particular, our case context is looking at watershed level coalitions that are bridging between farmers and policymakers to address agricultural nitrogen pollution. So I want to briefly share some of our exciting findings that give insight more broadly as to how boundary organizations may use policy narratives. So boundary organizations adapt the narratives they deliver when they're talking to different audiences. And they use key narrative strategies such as characterization, where they can highlight the different actors in an environmental network and frame them as victims, heroes, or villains. They also alter the plot elements that they focus on, and they frame events from different perspectives. And finally, they tend to emphasize their own role, highlighting both their knowledge and their unique position in the network of many actors, as well as their neutrality. And this constantly reminds their audiences the role that they play. And by shifting their narratives when they're talking to these different audiences, the boundary organizations really help to translate the message and hit home that they are legitimate and necessary for reaching cooperation and a solution in the complex environmental challenge. So for more information or to read the full paper, I would love to share it with you. Please reach out to me at the Q&A session or by email. Thanks for coming.